So we're extremely interested in the role of journalism. So one of the reasons that Sadie is remote, and we want to have her, is that she's supervising those who are at COP. So we're not going to ask all of you to answer every question, but COP is a special case in that it's huge, right? I think the estimates are 80 to 100,000 people there. But as journalists, do you cover COP the issues? Do you cover COP the spectacle? Do you cover COP just because it's a necessary thing that you need to do because of its scale and importance? It would seem to me a really difficult challenge with regard to what it is that you need to be talking about. I've seen some reporters simply describing their days of standing in line, getting tickets, badges, whatever it is, which is interesting. So Sadie, you're managing the coverage of that. Tell us about how you're approaching COP.
Yeah, I mean, it is a huge conference, as you said, Duke, with so many people there. And so we have a couple of reporters who are in Dubai. I'm actually in Phoenix, Arizona, where I'm based. And Nate Rott and Aya Batrawi are on the ground. And so I've been working with them usually overnight to help coordinate coverage. And it's a balancing act. We try and bring perspective and put these huge UN climate talks into perspective for the audience in a way that is accessible and meets them where they are at. And so we're trying not to cover every detail that unfolds in the negotiations, but looking at the bigger pictures. So we're taking a broad look at, what does it mean to have renewable energy triple, right? That's something that's being discussed at COP28. What does it mean to have language of phase out or phase down for fossil fuels? How does that impact trying to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius? We're trying to bring bigger stories that put all of that into context. And so one of the things that we've done, given that COP28 is happening in the United Arab Emirates, it's an oil producing country, that oil production is expanding. We put together an oil glossary because there are so many different terms flying around COP and different language like phase out, phase down, which will be such a sticking point as we head into the final days of COP. And we're finding that our audience is really hungry for that type of content because they're trying to understand, what is happening at this huge UN climate talk. And so I would say we're more issues focused. In the lead up to COP, we planned a bunch of stories to land, like so many of the people up on the stage did as well, to try and just explain the importance of the talks and also explore how do these talks matter in the grand scheme of things.
Mm-hmm. I see Rosanna shaking her head, and maybe it was around a couple of issues like language, literally and figuratively, and we talked a lot about that in our communications workshop. You want to mention why you're nodding at what Sadie's saying?
I just everything that Sadie just said really resonated with me. And I think, beyond that too, especially just the language in which we use to talk about climate change has been something I've been thinking a lot about, especially in the process of writing in book length form. And I'd be curious to hear what Dorothy thinks too. But, phase down versus, phase out, these are small but such significant ways of thinking about our relationship to these issues. And I'm sure during the workshop, you've probably discussed climate change versus climate crisis versus climate disruption or climate apocalypse. Also kind of how do we convey urgency and a disaster, and where is the audience? In this journey, this emotional journey of understanding the issue, right? Are we preaching to the choir, or are we bringing new people into this very important conversation that more people need to be engaged with? So I think that's something I'm consciously thinking about. I think NPR, has done a really incredible job just thinking about where we're meeting the audience and at what starting point is it? And also I think it's just so important with COP to have this accountability of being there, being in the room, covering what's happening. And then for me, from an LA Times perspective, I think it's so important to also, COP doesn't end after everyone leaves Dubai. So for me, it's, what is the accountability a year from now, 2 years from now, months from now, as these negotiations and agreements and kind of rhetoric gets said, and how do we actually execute that? And so the follow through of that, I think, is also important from a beat journalist perspective. That's not just covering what happens in these past 2 weeks, and it's what happens a year from now.
It might have been Ron Brownstein on Tuesday evening, where somebody said, talking about climate change turns ideological almost immediately. Talk to a farmer about the changing climate that he or she is experiencing. Oh yeah, let me tell you about that. It's really changing. So the use of language matters a lot. I'm thinking of Duchesne and Megan. For such a big issue like this one, COP and/or climate change or the changing climates, how do you set up your reporters, the things that you broadcast to be effective? Because I know you want to reach your audiences and have them feel, I hope, a sense of urgency around this issue.
So Aaron Stone, who was here at the conference earlier, is the main person reporting on what we call the climate emergency. And that was a deliberate term. We're fortunate enough, our newsroom has done quite a bit of work around human-centered design, which is basically a tool many companies, car companies use it. Probably a lot of people in the room are familiar with it. But in journalism, it was not typically something that you would do. So when we brought Aaron on board, we were able to do a deep dive into what the audience needed and what their understanding was. So we talked to several dozen people throughout Southern California about their understanding of climate change, about their questions about climate change, and that's really been something of a roadmap in terms of the stories we're choosing to cover. One of the things we learned that was so interesting, and it makes sense, is that when people are left with just a sense of hopelessness or an inability to act or to play any kind of role in making anything better, they kind of tune out, right? It just feels depressing. And so that was one of the things we learned from the conversations we had. And then more recently, when Karen Bass was elected mayor of Los Angeles, we did a pretty broad survey. Now, it's not scientific because it was voluntary, but we heard from several thousand people. We did a pretty good job of trying to make sure that we were accounting for both geography and diversity of the people who live in the city of Los Angeles, to hear about their top concerns and what they wanted the mayor to accomplish. Of course, probably no surprise to anyone, especially after the last panel, homelessness is top of mind of everyone here. That was the #1 issue across the board, no matter where you were coming from. But climate was prominent as well. And one of the things that was really interesting about what we heard back from people, the group most concerned about climate change was the oldest group, 65 and older. And they were very concerned, I think, about the future, even though they would not be living in it. So very concerned about their children, their grandchildren, and beyond, and acutely aware that action needed to take place now. And so we use that kind of feedback to orient our coverage and to make sure we're touching on those needs as we report out stories. And the one last thing I'll say, just because of the COP question, I mean, what we have learned is covering events, while very important and obviously important policy is being set, that if that's all you do, it's easy for people to move on. And that you have to figure out how you infuse that coverage throughout everything that you're doing. And that's why the conversation we had before, that you know that in Hollywood, it's not just the day after the apocalypse, it's happening now, and you have to figure out how do you cover it now. So we now do Climate Mondays, so every Monday we're dedicated to having climate coverage. And we also want to make sure that it's getting into other beats as well, because it does affect, it affects the homelessness crisis, it affects housing costs, it affects the economy, it affects everything that we do, and the more we're able to bring that to top of mind as we cover other areas, I think the more it stays with people how significant the issue is.
I'll just pick up right there, because that's what I was thinking in terms of the way we approach it. It's in everything. You really can't escape it at this point, right? From the Minnesota perspective, I mean, we are on native land. We talk about that a lot. We've done programming focused on our environment and our climate, where we centered Native American voices, because they've been in this game a long time, right? All day, every day for a long, long time. Many of us are just coming to it. We think about it from the marketplace perspective as affecting virtually all aspects of business at this point, right? And another important dimension of it, frankly, is I think about as we work to have our audiences look more like the communities we serve, we've got to inject issues of equity and race and all the other things. I mean, it's come up in bits and pieces over the last few days as well, obviously, right? Into how we frame the stories and who we're interviewing, into who the storytellers are, all of that, right? So that gets at relevance, right? And people are going to consume content that lands and feels authentic to them, and consume content that tells them something they didn't already know. And you're more likely to do that if you're talking to enough people, if you're providing true context, if it isn't just, we're all gonna die, but no, here are people, like lots and lots of people, smart people, passionate people, actively working to address it and to put all of us in a better position to make different and better choices. We come at that through a whole bunch of means, and really it's storytelling that emanates from what's actually happening in the world, nearby and across the globe, because we're all breathing the same air ultimately.
Yeah. And I want to put Neil on notice. I do want to ask you about Marketplace and how you've woven these issues into something that's perceived to be a show about economics, what's happening in dollars and cents, because I think it's genius to do that. But before I do that, Megan mentioned this can be exhausting. So Dorothy, you have decided to come over to the dark side and work on these really difficult issues. I mean, your show could be exhausting, both producing it and witnessing it. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you asked about COP to begin with, and our first episode actually takes place at a COP. So thinking about that episode kind of as a microcosm, we always tried to live in both a big scale and a small scale. That felt like sort of our storytelling challenge and opportunity was we wanted to talk about the macro issues. There are people in rooms who are rich and powerful, and they are making decisions, and those decisions have impact. And we didn't want to ignore them, but we also wanted to talk about all of the other people whose lives are unfolding daily. So in extrapolations, we made a bunch of decisions that were unusual for a show about climate. There aren't a ton of shows about climate. And when there are shows or movies, they tend to take place after the major event. So you pick up and we're in the rubble, right? And the thing has happened. And there's a bunch of reasons why you do that. One is stories in the rubble are actually pretty easy to break. You're looking for water. You're looking for weapons, you're looking for, safe people, you're running from the unsafe people. You can keep going, that's a really successful machine for, a story. Your characters are always in peril, and, there's always something exciting happening. But I felt really strongly like we were missing the most interesting part of the story, which is, well, how did we get here? Did we have to get here? It's not inevitable that we end up in rubble. We're not currently in rubble, not all of us right now. So how did it happen? What are the choices that were made? Who made those? And I felt like we were really kind of avoiding telling the most interesting story. So in extrapolations, we moved the timeline up. Our first episode begins in 2037, and we made a ton of choices to make it look pretty much like the COP that's happening now, in all aspects. So when we met with our costume designer, I would say, please don't put them all in silver jumpsuits, like, don't make anybody wear things where when we look at it, we go, that's not my world, So if you look at everyone's clothes, they're a little different, but they're not that far off. If you look at the technology, the way people use phones, it's not that different. It's a couple clicks on the dial, but it's a subtle change, and I wanted it to feel close. And I wanted to point out that this isn't a thing that either happens or doesn't happen. It's a thing that is happening and will continue to happen. So how do we make storytelling that feels ongoing, where every minute, every day, there are decisions that people are making?
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned something hugely important, that maybe it's easy to talk about on show the disaster after it's happened and the rubble, but did it have to happen? And I'm turning now to Brianna, who's writing about disaster, and the Tenant Cross Project at its foundation is about what do we know, how do we utilize that information in anticipation of avoiding what we're pretty sure would be a disaster, and we know what it will look like and where it will go. I did my work in New Orleans. We knew exactly where the water would go when Katrina hit, and it went right there. Did we prepare in advance enough for it? No. Why is that so difficult? From a disasters reporter's perspective, the before, during, and after, I suppose, is all part of your beat.
Yeah, I covered my first disaster in 2017. Hurricanes Irma and Maria hit the Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. I was on the U.S. Virgin Islands, and after that, I went straight to Santa Rosa. I got back to the newsroom, and they're like, "Hey, there's this fire. Can you go back up to Northern California?" I was like, "Okay." And seeing a fire take out a city like that, I think should have been a wake-up call, and it just really hasn't been for a lot of swaths of the country. And I think what's hard is seeing these happen again and again and again, and then they start to look the same. And what are we, and the people who they impact, there are so many that we don't know what happens to them. No one's keeping track of them. The only affordable housing that they had is gone. Their healthcare infrastructure is gone. They're dying. We're not keeping track of deaths after disasters. And I do keep coming back to the same question, is like, what are we doing? Who is in charge? And who's letting people who are in charge get away with not preparing? So Maui, for example, that fire was 100% preventable. There were so many warning signs, and that fire was very similar actually to the Marshall Fire, which is in Colorado, which was also preventable. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think we're really just getting very slow institutionally to catch up, and it's because it's expensive. It's not lucrative, for industries like oil and insurance to stop doing what they're doing, and governments are too short-staffed to hold these people to account. I've been doing a lot of investigating in Florida. Those industries are very tied together with the government, and there's no real federal oversight of this. Like, FEMA is so small, it's so understaffed. So I think federally we have to really be more robust in attacking the institutions who are not doing their jobs.
So if you're investigating that, writing about it, and now I'm asking, maybe it's sort of a personal question, at what point do you say, this has got to be different, and could you ever imagine yourself moving from the reporting realm to I'd like to get involved in making sure that this doesn't keep happening the same way? I now know enough I could be helpful in some way.
That's an interesting question. Not for a while, because I really am passionate about going as far as I can with families and spending a lot of time with them. And again, coming back, and I did one story where I focused on 9 Hurricane Ian survivors who were living in a 2-star motel for a year. And I went back 6 times. So I do, though, have a lot of emotion about it, and so maybe at some point when I just get so fed up that I'm like, yes, I'm going to go to the other side. But I still want to keep, telling stories from the people and voices that we don't really get to hear from a lot.
Because obviously we want the preventative possibilities to be heard, read, seen in whatever media we choose, and people to then respond appropriately. But as I think you and others point out, it's easy to respond to disaster. We see the people in need. There they are, right then, we contribute. Getting people to take action about something that has yet to happen is really hard, even if we know it's going to happen. Dorothy?
Well, and also nobody gets credit.
Huh?
I mean, if you think about it from a political point of view, you can't run a campaign on look at the disaster I prevented, I promise it would have been worse.
Yeah.
It's not an effective message. I mean, I think it's a valid thing that happens in the world, but I think if you look at the incentive structures, it's very hard to tell a story about how things are bad, but no, trust me, they could have been a lot worse. I think that's just a really tricky story to tell. I mean, I think you see it in the varying climate graphs. We want to have a binary, it happened or it didn't. Climate change is a switch. It goes up or down. And to go no, look, we made it to this number, which is bigger than 0, but less than this other number, but also they're in Celsius, and you don't usually use Celsius. But I promise, we did this amazing thing with the numbers, and yes, your life is bad, but it would have been so much more. It's dodgy. It's a really hard thing. You want to, stop the bad guy from coming in. Instead, you're we let in a series of smaller, lesser bad guys. That's uncomfortable.
That sounds like a great movie, Smaller, Lesser Bad Guys. You can't see them, but they're there. Rosanna.
I was going to say, even after the disaster, what I think is so fascinating, and going back kind of to the language that we use, two terms kind of kept coming up in the course of my reporting. First is the term natural disaster. What is actually natural about it? It's actually we're the disaster. We're in the way of all of these forces, and we're not living in better reciprocity as, folks who've been here for thousands of years have done so. And then the other term that really came up, and I feel like this will be a word that really connects with folks in the room, is the word resilience. What does it actually mean to be resilient? And that is such a buzzword, whether it's in science or community planning or urban management. And what does it actually mean to recover and be resilient after a disaster? And so many of our systems today really reinforce this old school notion that resilience means having the strength to remain unchanged, to be able to bounce back from what we lost. And so, the insurance systems have been set up that paradise gets raised, and resilience is to rebuild exactly what we lost in the exact place that we lost it. And it's a failure of imagination in many ways. And so we continue to repeat these cycles, and our systems also haven't caught up to this notion of what it actually means to transform the very systems that have gotten us into the situation in the first place. And those are the conversations that I'm curious about. What are the opportunities to kind of truly move forward rather than to reinforce all of, is the status quo what we actually want to preserve into the future? Talk to any frontline community or any community that has been saddled with the way we've built our society, is that actually how we want to reinforce it? And I don't think those questions have been asked in truly a way that advances the conversation, and we can do a lot more, and I think the folks in this room are very equipped to do that.
And you hit on two words that came up during the Climate Communications Workshop: resilience and natural, and we interrogated those. Sadie has her real but virtual hand up.
It's always strange having somebody virtual. I wish I was in the room, physically in the room with all of you, because this
Just
is
knock
such
on the screen so I can hear it.
Just knock on the screen, yeah. This is such a valuable conversation, and I really appreciate everything that has been said between all of our panelists. I think in terms of journalism and the stories, I worry that more isn't necessarily better, but how we frame stories about climate change really is important. And so when we're talking about words like natural disaster, there's nothing natural about that. We need to say what it is. And one of the approaches that we are taking at NPR is really sort of being a guide for the listener or the reader to connect the dots and not assume that everybody is right along with us, right? So it's taking time to break down what these words mean. It's taking time to frame stories in a way that are accessible. And it's also about, we find with stories that are focused more on solutions, and not that we're going to solve all of climate change all of a sudden, but there are stories that focus on giving, helping people understand that they do have agency. They do very, very well. Our listenership, our readership is off the charts. And I'll just give an example of a story that we did recently. It was an audio story, part of the Consider This podcast, and it was about Florida's key deer, which are endangered. And they're actually a real success story because their numbers have rebounded. You have these small deer showing up in people's yards, but they're actually still endangered because of rising sea levels and encroaching on their habitat. And we took a different approach with that story. Nate Rott, was on the islands where the deer are. He followed people around. It was a really engaging, sound-rich story. And there was this issue of, here's a community that's trying to save these deer. And that story, off the charts, listenership was so high. So I wanted to share that with all of you because I think it's on us as journalists to really make sure that we're defining the terms, not buying into the jargon, and framing these stories. And to this point about thinking about the world in a different way, I think humans we always kind of hold on to this nostalgia of the way things used to be. And the one thing that's constant is change. And how do we tell these stories that actually could build to a body of work, a body of journalism that shows what that future looks like? I think that's an area in our field that we could do a lot on.
Okay. Megan?
I mean, I just wanted to continue on from what Sadie was saying to talk about what I think journalism can do. And I think changes in how when I started in journalism and where I am now. So one of the things that we talk about in my newsroom, and I think a lot of other newsrooms now, which frankly, when I started out, I never even heard of this concept, and that's planning for impact. So that's the idea that there is potentially an outcome you want to achieve from your coverage. So, it's a little bit tricky because as journalists, the traditional journalists were trained not to be activists, right? But yet we're activists for the truth, we're activists for public access. There's a lot of things I think we are activists for. But the truth is, if you're going to do like a year-long investigation, of course you want an outcome. You didn't spend that time for it just to go away. And so I think when we're more intentional about it, we can accomplish a lot. So I'll give an example that is an actual natural disaster, well, a fake one, but still. We did a podcast 5 or so years ago called The Big One, Your Survival Guide. So that was really taking people deep into what would be the after effects of a very big earthquake here in Los Angeles. And we did, I think, Vanity Fair called it speculative journalism. But essentially it was storytelling, right? Because what we realized was when the story was first pitched, the top boss basically said, everyone knows there's going to be a big earthquake. Everyone knows this. This is not news. And everyone is ready. And yeah, exactly. So what we did was we went out and we actually asked people, what they knew and if they were ready. And they kind of knew that probably there would be a big earthquake here, and literally no one was ready. And so when we thought about, planning for impact, what we wanted to do was to motivate people to actually get ready. And frankly, we did that by scaring the, what out of them. But, it's, if you've heard it, it'll wake you up. But that was the idea. The outcome we wanted was for people to take action. And we heard from a lot of people who did, in fact, take action. I'm sure LA is not ready. But the idea was, what kind of story do you want to tell, and what do you want to happen because of that storytelling? And it changes how I work as an editor, and I think how our newsroom operates.
Right. It's not a passive act when you're thinking that way. There's an outcome after the story. It's not just publication. Brianna.
I also, that was a great podcast, by the way. I want to return to the word recovery, too, because I think that this is so misunderstood, that a community actually never recovers from a disaster. It is forever changed. It has such a trickle-down effect, down to the tax base, right? These people can't then afford to pave new roads if so many people are leaving after a disaster, things like that. So this has a lifelong impact. And the people who do, quote unquote, recover are people with money. And most people in this country don't have the time, the energy, or the money to even think about preparing for a disaster and then what they'll do after that disaster. And they expect the government will pick them up. So in terms of storytelling, I think these kind of trying to focus on the education and the lack of preparation that we're doing as a country, like emergency management, for example. Talk about, I think, was it you said, that it's such a thankless job, right? An emergency manager is doing a good job if nothing is happening, but most places only have one emergency manager. So, and how much money, when you compare that, are developers making to develop in these areas that these emergency managers have to then clean up with, making $30,000 a year. So I think kind of approaching it from really the accountability lens and trying to show those ties, like you were saying, the year-long investigation is the way that we really also should be trying to approach climate change or climate emergency journalism. Yeah.
And we typically have questions at the end of these panels, but I'm going to take the prerogative of assigning people. So Neil, I hope to see you at that microphone soon.
Boo.
And Dean Batts, I hope to see you at that other microphone over there with regard to the education of young journalists in this field. So others of you who hadn't wanted to respond to what was just being said.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing about audience, because we thought about it a ton with extrapolations, because we didn't want people to just cry on their couch, right? That was not our goal, was just sort of to leave people in a puddle and then I don't know, hope they get some popcorn or something. We were trying to really, hopefully, move people in a place where there was some sort of positive outcome. And a big shift that we had when we thought about this was to not think of all of our audience as a bunch of isolated individuals, but to do what we could as a show to urge people to come together. So we would end every episode, there was a website you could go to, and it would have sort of a decision tree of like, what issues are you interested in? And like, where do you live? And how can you find people? And the whole thing was geared towards connecting with other people, because I think that understanding climate change is something that you are personally going to emotionally process and or make a difference on by yourself in your living room alone is daunting and depressing, but understanding it as something that is a basis with which you can form community and connection and start to envision that, you know, world that I was talking about, where like maybe things look a little different. What might we want the world to look like? Or, you know, can we share some of the meals that I have, you know, stored in my shed? Whatever that is, you need other people. So we always thought about our audience finding each other.
Address the issue of students and education.
Sure, thanks. Hey, Sadie, great to see you. And so this sort of speaks to something that you know well, is that, first of all, amongst students, you know, there's this misnomer that there's apathy amongst students as it relates to what's going on in the world around them. That is so very wrong. Students today have a sense of service and wanting to make the world better, and what better way to do it than through journalism and engaging communities. So the question is, how do we prepare not only students, but really prepare newsrooms, current newsrooms, to better engage with audiences and to cut through that apathy that may exist as a result of political division? How do we get people to coalesce around basic facts and principles that there is something not only wrong, but something that we can all do together to help to solve the problems that we are reporting on?
You know, I think public media, more than most sort of mainstream media, really works to create spaces where people of differing opinions and different experiences and paths in life can inhabit the same intellectual space. And I say that because there are a lot of outlets out there, a lot of ways of approaching it that are about driving division. We're much more about driving conversation and driving engagement. I think who really, in the end, like the people in the room decide what news is. Who's in the room makes a critical difference. Who's in the room in terms of all the different demographic dimensions that come to mind, right? And then how do you create an environment where everybody, whether they're the guy in his mid-50s or the emerging journalist in her mid-20s or early 20s, that we want all the voices in the room. That's the work to be done. And frankly, it came up earlier. I think you have a lot of folks who are now grandparents thinking about the future for their grandkids and beyond. And then we have certainly a lot of young people in journalism who are in journalism because they recognize that their voices and the voices of their peers absolutely have to be heard more loudly and more clearly. And so I think the real key is creating environments where you have those different perspectives all playing together and being integrated. We've got, just very quickly, we've got a project rolling out later this month called Talking Sense, which is going to be news programming and town halls and an app on your phone to help people engage in fruitful, constructive conversations with people with whom they disagree. And it's in integrating marriage and family counseling sort of tips and practices. Specifically, we're going to an election year, right? And we're all kind of, if we're being honest, kind of like bracing for it, right? Because we just know how ugly it is. I was talking to someone at Dabani, I don't know if she's in the room still, but at the reception last night, about the fact that she really, really scaled back her news consumption because it was just so ugly. Right? So not saying that's not going to be part of what's coming, but many of us are actively working to create the kinds of journalism and storytelling and sort of spaces where we can sit with things that make us uncomfortable, sit with things that maybe make us angry, and listen a little differently and find ways to build more understanding and connection so that we might make better decisions together.
I think, just real quick, I've been thinking a lot about, very early in my career, my first big story was going to come out the next day, and I remember my editor telling me, Rosanna, if everyone tomorrow who's quoted in the article hates you just a little bit, why did you have to go talk to this person? Great story, but why did you have to talk about this or go in this direction? My editor said that means you are fair, that you are truly fair about the way you approach the story. You talk to all sides. And the longer I've been doing this, especially in the space of climate change communication and climate change reporting, I realized that another way to think about this is also, the day your big story comes out, does everyone in the article who was quoted feel heard? And I think that also means fairness. And I think it's a slight shift in the energy and the approach, and also just making sure, what does it mean to truly deeply listen to someone, to validate what they're feeling, and then to take that conversation to the next step once we kind of first find our commonality, and to truly allow someone to feel like they got to say their piece. And then beyond that, beyond making every person at the table and every person on all sides of the issue feel heard in your story, what does it mean to also think about all the people who are not at the table that could be at the table? And so for me, with climate change, we talked a lot about the intersectionalities. Going to a community, I was like that bumbling reporter who wanted to talk about sea level rise, but this community wants to talk about how every single kid in their community seems to get asthma by the time they're in 5th grade. They want to talk about how they have no green space, no park for their kids to go to. If only they had a park, the kids would have something different to do after school that would totally change potentially the course of their life. They want to talk about cancer rates and life expectancy. And it is our job as journalists also to recognize that these are climate change stories, that what this community wants isn't bring them into the climate change conversation, and that totally expands, again, like allowing someone to feel heard, allowing someone to feel engaged, and I think truly it begins with deep listening and deep hanging out, and that takes time, and that's something that we are all short on, but I found that the more you spend time with people, especially people who disagree with the issue and disagree with you, is where we start these conversations that really lead to more meaningful engagement.
Sadie, hang on. I see your hand. I want to get 2 questions in from the audience here from people who I think we want to hear from. And we might go a few minutes long if everybody's okay with that. Dave. And Dave was on our insurance panel just the other day.
So you all do a terrific job in a very thoughtful and meaningful way of trying to convey information about the climate crisis. What do we do about the media organizations and the journalists that half of America is listening to very attentively that aren't covering this story or that are conveying misinformation about it? And I don't expect you to solve the problem, but as professionals in this space that pay close attention to this space, I'm wondering if you have any insights or suggestions, because half America is hearing from media that are telling them it's not happening, don't worry about it, go do something else.
I mean, it's a big concern, right? I think, like, in some respects, like, the way that media has changed is positive, right? We don't have one central voice that's telling us everything that's true that was never really entirely true. On the other hand, I think we've moved away in really fundamental and concerning ways in this country from the idea that there is like a truth, or that it feels like people get to pick and choose, which can be frustrating. I think, to Rosanna's point, that part of the answer, and to what Duchesne was saying too, is to make sure that those of us who really are trying to listen to everyone are doing that in a respectful way. So we just brought in a panel of people who describe themselves as either Republican or conservative to listen to how they were perceiving the coverage. So for us, the coverage is national public radio coverage, it's Marketplace, it's the BBC, it's all the shows we run and the coverage that we do. And what we heard from those folks basically was they didn't want to feel like we were insulting them. They wanted to feel like we were, obviously we're not going to say, oh, climate change isn't real. We're not going to say, oh, you're right about that. However, I think that that's what we can do in sort of the mainstream or more traditional media. We can not alienate people further, and we can figure out how to invite them in and not be insulting. So if you're taking that person's viewpoint and it's incorrect, you don't call them dumb, right? You try to figure out a way of conveying the story that might actually resonate with them and get them to think a little bit differently, which we all can stand to think a little bit differently. I think, when we get challenged, it's good. So, I don't know what to tell you about I mean, Fox News or Breitbart or whatever the heck the rest of those places are called. But, it's like, it's problematic. But I think all you can really do is try to have an anecdote in the mainstream media. And then I think for Dorothy, and there is a role not outside of news to get these feelings and beliefs into the public consciousness.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think, whatever you say about liberal Hollywood, like climate change is not on TV in anybody's show. So there's a lot of work for everybody to do there. And, Norman Lear just recently passed, and everyone in television has been thinking a lot about him. And, that was the day where you did have only a few channels. You had sort of one central mouthpiece. And so if somebody got in the position where they had a primetime sitcom and they were making bold choices and showing conflict, it could really captivate a nation. And I think if you look at the way he did it on All in the Family, it wasn't being insulting, it wasn't, derisive, it was really showing it in the context of a family that loves each other, as a metaphor for America, where like there is disagreement and there is, people have the way they were brought up or the way they think things are right, but at the end of the day, the goal is to keep the family together. So how do we have an argument and still love each other? There are 900 channels now. I don't know. I don't know how you do it when...
And still nothing to watch.
And still nothing, and still we're just watching Suits on Netflix. So I don't know how in the era of so much content at constant demand where the algorithm is telling you what it thinks you already want to see again, you get that kind of Norman Lear platform. But I do think anybody who makes a TV show that is watched by a broad swath of America, that is watched by people of diverse, ideological backgrounds, diverse economic backgrounds, has a real opportunity to put shows, put ideas, put concepts in there, but in a way that is respectful, that is not bopping anybody over the head. And also, it has to be a good show. Like people are just going to turn it off if the show's not fun. So it has to be all the things you'd want a show to be: funny and sexy and moving and exciting and all of that. No one's going to hear your sea level rise if the people aren't hot.
So Sadie's going to jump through the monitor if I don't call on her, and I will. But Brianna first, and then Sadie, and then we're coming over to Neil.
To return to your question, I want to... empathy, right? Like, I think that that's the way to really break through platforms, and is you take people viscerally there, because a lot of the times this is happening to people who can relate to like their grandparents, right, who lose their homes in Hurricane Ian. And I've had a lot of experience with this in Northern California, in Florida, in Texas, in very red, Trumpian places that are losing everything they have to a disaster. And do they say it's climate change? Maybe not, but we can go in and just show how this completely ruins a life. And I have actually, I used to work at BuzzFeed, and now I'm at Washington Post. I was at Daily Beast for a hot second. And I would hear from readers from Florida who were Republican asking, I did one story on the water crisis in Jackson and how it specifically affects Black mothers and why. And so was that a climate change story? Yes, but I just really pointed at a Black single mother and what this water crisis did to her entire life, down to not being able to pay the bills or her car payment. And I had a ton of people from Mississippi, from Florida, reaching out asking how do they help, right? So I'm sure that Daily Beast was not really on their usual readership, but if it's a good story that really shares how people are hurting, and you get that emotion and empathy, I think that goes a long way.
Sadie.
I agree on the empathy piece and listening and making sure that you have everybody in the room, and those perspectives are reflected in our stories. I think we're specifically to the question posed, we are living in an age where there are 900, cable channels, and social media is just churning out content left and right, and a lot of it is wrong. There's so much misinformation and disinformation. It's a little bit like, as a journalist, like playing whack-a-mole if you just approach it one by one. And so I don't have a solution, which is why these conversations, I think, are so valuable. But one thing I think as journalists, and certainly how we're approaching it at NPR, is accountability journalism really resonates with our audience. And I think especially to Dean Batts's question about education and students, helping journalists, young journalists who are just starting out in their careers, understand what accountability journalism is and how to do it, and how to do what's often referred to as pre-bunk, like be ahead of the misinformation as best you can, which is super challenging because there's so much of it, is where we need to be helping student journalists learn how to do that kind of work, and also for journalists to just make that as much as of anything into their climate reporting. And I'll just give a very specific example that just happened. Ahead of COP, the COP president, Sultan Al Jaber, said, there's no science to phasing out fossil fuels, and that would keep temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And then he later tried to walk that back. And then just last night he was saying, we need to trust the science, right? So there's this misinformation that was originally said, and we did a story about this, and the Guardian did stories. Other outlets picked this up as well. I think when something is wrong, we need to say that's wrong, and not repeat that wrongness. You put the truth back out there, and that's not going to go towards changing anybody's perception on climate change or reaching audiences that are really hard to do or hard to reach. But maybe that collective action of doing that will lead to getting more correct information out there in a way that people can engage with it.
So Neil, what was the conversation like in the conference room where for Marketplace, a show dedicated to contemporary economics and the national financial picture, about a section called How We Survive? How did that get into that show?
That's actually a great question because prior to How We Survive launching, and our last episode of the last season was yesterday, so pay attention if you can. But, there's all this conversation that we're having now and previously about the sky is falling, climate change, the sky is falling. And the premise of How We Survive was, well, who's going to sell the umbrellas? Who's going to build, different housing in Florida away from the water? Who's going to rebuild paradise out of different materials? And so our whole framework for How We Survive is who's going to win when we go forward? What resources do we need to start developing now? What systems need to be in place to actually get ahead of, the issues that we know are coming? We've tried to switch our brand belief at Marketplace to have equity as an outcome. So it's information begets empowerment, begets equity. And so for us, we're trying to make regular people the stars of our stories. When we do environmental racism to create equity, we do that. The second season of How We Survive was in Florida, where water was rising and a skyscraper fell. And we had one episode there called Little River, which was about this imperiled neighborhood where this Haitian family couldn't sell their home because they had 2 mortgages. They couldn't get insurance. The state wasn't helping them. So there were so many business aspects to this climate change. It was insurance fraud. It was predatory lending. It was lack of resources to fix the water problem on their street, which actually had raw sewage coming down the street when it flooded. And so every tentacle that we looked at in climate had some business outcome, or where's the money? You could ask this panel, how are we going to pay for all this stuff? And we'd still be talking. So for us, Duke, the real framework was, let's try to provide some answers or some roadmaps for the future. And then, as I said a couple minutes ago, the stars of our story are the people we interview. And so, we tried to create empathy by letting people see themselves in every situation, whether it was a historical redux of tribal rights or whether it was how people are coping. We asked Jerome Powell and the chairman of COP about their job, not about statistics about climate and the economy, but how is their job going? And I think that helps people see, helps simplify the finances.
So Richard, I assume you want to ask a question. How about make it one short one? And why don't you identify who you would like to answer it, and then we'll do a final wrap up here with the panel.
Well, I'm not sure which is the best, because then if I choose one over the other, then I could have. Let me use an example very quickly. Houston Chronicle. So you've got the main beat, you've got the local beat, you've got the real estate beat, you've got the business beat. What we figured out, and this is a question, what we figured out is that one of the challenges that you all have talked a little bit about is the different audiences and the different readers and the different messages, right? Then the Houston Business Journal is just down the street, which tends to cover a lot about real estate. One of the things I'm wondering is, how do you all see the connection to being able to talk to the business community, the real estate community, about these stories and about what are the facts behind some of this that are impacting their sector? Because they do read this, but there's often not that many places for them other than like the Urban Land Institute, which is nothing negative about these sector or industry folks. So I guess what I'm asking is, how do y'all see the integration with other parts of the readership that are kind of divided into these different streams of the paper?
The Washington Post is going to answer.
Well, so I've been working with the business desk at the Post, and I mean, a big story that the federal government is actually now investigating the insurance industry on is this: are we going to have a 2007 housing crash because people can't get insurance? They're not able to rebuild. Their property values are going down, and the whole reason, or not the whole, but a massive reason, is because the insurance industry is citing climate change as reason that they're not insuring that, right? And in the back of that is like the reinsurance industry, and who's examining the reinsurance industry, and where is that language coming from? That is it really disasters? So I mean, I think like it's so blatant. Are you having trouble having these conversations?
I'm wondering how in y'all's reporting and you're doing this. Well, yes, we all are in some way or another. But what I'm saying is, the front page has one set of readers, but when you go, when you start going into the bit, like you just said, when you start going into the business section and the real estate section, right?
Right.
You start getting a whole set of other folks who I think are sitting there kind of going, I had no clue.
Well, as an institution, I mean, this is a question for you, but at BuzzFeed and at the Washington Post, we just started putting in a paragraph in climate change in every story. If it was a business story, if it was an insurance story, health story, and it had an aspect of climate change because it was related to a heat wave, it was related to a freeze, it was related to a hurricane or something, but and the ripple effect of that. So maybe just as a paper and institution, like we did this with gun violence as an epidemic, climate disasters, like having maybe a unified conversation that even if it's a business story and it's about the real estate that's coming or crash that might be coming, that's connected to climate change.
Right.
Okay. I know some people have to catch some planes. I see some luggage being moved around over here. I want to give you all a last chance to just say, based on this conversation, what else you might like to tell us. A short something or other that's on your mind or you think this audience should go away with regard to communications, journalism, and what we're confronting. Dorothy, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So I was recently at the Ag Museum in Jackson, Mississippi, and I was talking with a young lady at the desk, and we just talked about the weather. And there used to, every year there's a state fair in October, and when she was a kid and she went to the state fair in October, she wore a sweater, everybody brought blankets, and this year when she goes to the state fair, everyone's in shorts and tank tops. And I don't think that conversation changed the world. I don't think I'm like, well, brush my hands, I am done, I fixed it. But I think finding ways to talk to people about their experience. So I wasn't telling her anything. I was asking her questions, and I think she felt heard, and I think we could talk about the changes in the weather and how weird it is that she's wearing a tank top to the state fair. And I think the more that you talk to people like they're an expert, they will then tell you their expertise.
It's the difference between climate change and the climate is changing.
Yeah.
Duchesne.
Yeah, I want to just say thank you for pulling this together. This mix of people, the conversations over the last few days, and just watching the dynamic sort of vibe flowing through, I'm leaving with a bunch of story ideas and a bunch of hope and a bunch of energy for the work ahead. So then thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here. The bottom line is that this is how this kind of issue gets solved, or these issues. It's not one thing, right? And so this opportunity to be in a network of folks actively thinking about what better would look like is really critical.
And Sadie, if you could see yourself, your monitor head is between Duchesne and Rosanna, so you get to go next.
Oh my gosh. So yes, I just want to echo what Duchesne is saying, and thank you for pulling this together. This has been a really interesting conversation, and I think that these, as we look at journalism and how our field is covering climate change, it's complex and it's nuanced, and I think it does come down to what Dorothy's saying, which is meeting people where they are and not telling them, but listening and having empathy and bringing those stories of people who are experiencing climate change to our air, to our readers, to broadcast, and giving a little sense of hope. And when I say hope, I'm not saying like capital, like Pollyanna, like everything is good, because it's not. But helping people understand, I feel like in almost every single story we do about human-driven climate change, there is an element of hope that comes in the form of a community that's responding to adapting to climate change in a different way. Or I'm working on a story with one of our member stations that will go next week about kids and climate change education, and it's this sweet story about children who are, I think they're like 10 years old. They did this whole year-long composting project and trying to understand methane gas and how it impacts our atmosphere. And it's not a heavy-hitting story. It's full of sound-rich voices from these kids, and they're sharing their thoughts and hopes for the future, which they're growing up and will know nothing different than a world with climate change. And I think those stories go a long way, as well as the accountability stories and the solution stories that we do.
Before we go to Rosanna, I want to make sure that you know about her book, California Against the Sea. It's a great read.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'm just going to build off of everything that everyone has just said. I think in addition to meeting where someone is, like where they are, meeting them in their vulnerability, I think has been really powerful for me. And truly, often in the field when I'm talking to people, the conversations, the way I've started these conversations increasingly have become just unpacking like what they're afraid of, why they're concerned, why they don't want to talk to me, or why they don't want to engage on this issue. And I think truly meeting someone, not just putting yourself in their shoes, but putting yourself in their vulnerability, whether it is a property owner worried about whether or not they can get a refinance on their home, or a frontline community truly concerned about health issues and inequities. And with the book, I think in the process of writing it, I remember my book editor, who's very different than my LA Times editor, she told me after my first draft that a book needs to attend to not just the reader's intellectual journey, but also their philosophical journey and ultimately their emotional journey. And I think as a news reporter, I was so focused for so long on the intellectual journey, translating the facts, bridging the science and the policy, that I think just I encourage all of you to think about the emotional journey of just the conversations that you're having and ultimately the philosophical journeys, because truly we can't science our way out of this problem. This is not just a problem where the facts will guide us forward. We have to understand the emotions underlying why there is resistance, why there is fear and concern and anxiety, and ultimately how do we take those emotions and help transform the philosophical kind of approach that we're taking to building and moving towards this future that we desperately need to move towards.
I think it's very heartening to hear us having conversations about the intersection of all these very once disparate topics and issues and institutions. My biggest thing is to not forget about all these communities that once a disaster hits, they're in the news for like 2 weeks and then we move on, because as society, as humans, we just like to forget and put our head in the sand until the next thing happens, and we're like, oh, how did that happen? But to remember to all these people who are still struggling to get by day, and then to check back. And accountability, I think, going forward is just the biggest thing that we have in our power, is to keep checking these people, these institutions who are supposed to be protecting people, who are supposed to be bolstering our infrastructure, who are not supposed to be taking money from the insurance industry to pass new legislation that's pro-insurance, et cetera. So I think that holding people to account and then not forgetting those who have gone through something is where I'll leave it.
I'd just say, as someone who's running a newsroom and is having to make decisions about what we're covering and how we're covering it, I think we just can't be boring, And I think that if we have a sense of urgency about these societal issues, whether it's climate change, the climate emergency, homelessness, there's a whole range of them, we have to figure out how to engage people. Back when I was in college, a long time ago, and I thought I was too nice to be a journalist, so I was going to be a historian, I was studying sort of the early days of TV news, and there was a man named Reuven Frank who ran NBC News in the very beginning, very transitional moment between radio and TV news. A lot of people thought TV news would ruin everything. We can talk about that at a different conference. And he said something that has stuck with me back from when I was a student journalist not planning to do it professionally. He said, it's the job of the journalist to make important stories interesting. And I think if that's where you're starting, every time you're reporting on these big issues, you're not being boring, you're figuring out how to get people's attention. I think we're doing our job, and it's a big job, it's an important job, and I'm so appreciative of everyone who came to listen today.
Great. Thank you so much.